Last night I found the letter again, the one I swore I had thrown away. It slipped from between pages of the novel where he first came to life, tucked quietly between chapter 5 and 6, like it had been waiting. I unfolded it with trembling fingers, and there it was, my own words, written in the second person, as if I had once believed someone real might read them. "I made you up," it began, "but you loved me exactly the way I needed." In that moment, I remembered everything. The nights I imagined his voice, the way I added freckles to his face, the imaginary argument we once had when he didn't. "Come home." I had loved a ghost built from hope and silence. But here's the truth I can't ignore anymore. If you never truly existed, then what exactly did I lose? And why? Does it still hurt like something real? Claire lived alone, in a small second-floor apartment that overlooked the kind of quiet street where time seemed to soften its pace. The town, nestled along the main coastline, smelled of salt and pine, and sometimes, if the wind blew right, you could hear the ocean hum in your teacup. Her apartment was the kind you'd walk past without noticing. But if you ever stepped inside, you'd understand that someone lived there very carefully. Books were stacked in every corner, some open to the same pages for weeks, others filled with handwritten notes in the margins. A kettle always sat ready on the stove, and a gray cat named Oliver lounged in sunspots as if he, too, had stories he wasn't telling. Claire was 47, divorced, and no longer expected phone calls past 8 p.m. Her days were quiet, filled with editing, manuscripts, watering a single peace lily, and rearranging her thoughts. But every Thursday night, after dinner and just before bed, she sat down with a glass of red wine and wrote a letter. Always to the same man. Always to James. He didn't exist. Not in any way that mattered to the world. But to Claire, James had been her companion for nearly a year. She'd given him a name, a face, a laugh that rumbled like an old song, and a way of looking at her that made silence feel like conversation. These letters weren't fantasies. They were small pieces of what she needed: tenderness, attention, the comfort of being known without having to explain. People might have called it lonely. Claire called it safe. And perhaps that's what made it dangerous, because the more she wrote, the more she believed someone like him could exist. That if she imagined him fully enough, down to his favorite book, his habit of falling asleep during storms, then maybe, somewhere out there, someone would recognize the space she left open for him. Have you ever imagined someone who might love you just right? It started with a drawer she hadn't opened in months. The late October wind had rattled the windows all evening, whispering through the cracks like an old friend urging her toward something she'd tried to forget. Claire stood at her writing desk, staring at the wooden drawer just below the stack of unpaid bills and worn-out notebooks. Her fingers hesitated on the handle, not from fear, but from knowing exactly what waited inside. Inside were letters, over 50 of them, folded neatly, dated in the top corner, each sealed with a quiet kind of hope. They weren't love letters, in the traditional sense. No flowery declarations, no promises of forever. These were one-way conversations, pieces of her heart written to a man named James, who never existed outside the ink of her pen and the longing in her mind. She had promised herself she would throw them away before the year ended. A cleansing, she had told Maggie over coffee weeks ago, like trimming dead branches to let the light in. But now, holding them again, the weight felt different. Less like paper, more like memory. As she sifted through the stack, one letter caught her eye. Unfinished, the edges curled, the pen stroke broken halfway through a sentence. She unfolded it carefully, breath slowing as her eyes scanned the page. "I know you're not real, but why do I still miss you?" The ink had smudged slightly, as if touched by a teardrop or perhaps just time. Claire didn't remember writing. She couldn't place the night, the mood, What might have led her to begin a letter she never finished, but something about those words stopped her cold. There was a tenderness in that question, an ache that felt too honest to ignore. She sat down slowly, smoothing the paper flat on the desk, and reached for her favorite pen. If she was going to let go, really let go, she needed to finish that sentence. Not just for James, or the version of herself who once needed him, but for the part of her that still clung to the possibility of being loved like that. Completely, imaginatively, without condition. The room was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the hum of Oliver's breath as he slept, curled, in the armchair. Claire poured herself a glass of wine, not out of habit, but ritual, like lighting a candle before a vigil. She sat at the desk, pulled the letter closer, and began to write, not knowing where the words would take her, only that they needed to come. I miss you in the way I miss summer rain, something that never stays long enough, but leaves its scent on everything. I miss the way you listened without interrupting, the way your presence made the day feel softer, as if nothing bad could happen while you were around. I know you're not real, but I still talk to you on my worst days. Isn't that strange? I imagine you beside me when the world feels too sharp. I imagine your hand on mine, your silence more comforting than anyone's words. Her pen moved faster, now urgency growing in her chest. The wine sat untouched. You were everything I hoped someone could be. And I wonder now if I built you because I couldn't find that in anyone else. Or maybe because I was too tired to keep being disappointed. But loving you, loving the idea of you, was never a lie. It was survival. You filled in the empty spaces I didn't have the courage to share with someone real. You didn't let me down, because I never gave you the chance. Maybe that's why this hurts. Maybe that's why this feels like a goodbye. Claire paused. Her hand trembled just slightly. She looked at the page, ink still drying, and exhaled. She hadn't planned to finish the letter. But now, as the last line stared back at her, something inside her began to settle, the way snow does after a storm. This wasn't just closure. This was release. It hadn't started as anything serious. One night, after finishing a novel she didn't particularly enjoy, Claire found herself lingering on the final page longer than usual, not because it moved her, but because it didn't. The characters had felt hollow, their love rushed, their dialogue like something lifted from a greeting. Card. She closed the book with a sigh, poured herself a second glass of wine, and whispered aloud to no one. I could have written it better. The truth was, she wasn't thinking about fiction anymore. That night, the apartment felt emptier than usual. Oliver had disappeared into the closet. The music had long stopped, and her phone remained defiantly silent. It was the kind of silence that doesn't comfort. It scratches. She sat back down, took out her notebook, and began to write. Not a story, not a journal entry, but a name. James. She didn't know where it came from. Perhaps a character she once admired, or an old teacher's soft-spoken voice. But the moment she wrote it, she saw him. Dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, kind eyes behind bookish glasses, and a faint trace of cologne that reminded her of cedarwood and old records. He wasn't handsome in the traditional sense, but he was safe, and warm, and familiar. Over the next hour, James came to life. She gave him a favorite album, Nick Drake's Pink Moon, and a laugh that started slow, like water boiling. She decided he brewed coffee with cinnamon, hated social media, and preferred handwritten notes over texts. She imagined how he'd sit beside her, shoes off, reading the newspaper aloud in a voice that made even the sad stories sound like lullabies. She didn't know it then, but that was the moment she began to fall. In the days that followed, James became part of Claire's routines. When she cooked, she imagined his voice teasing her for always burning the onions. When she chose a movie, she pictured him sitting next to her, predicting the ending with just the right amount of smugness. It wasn't about pretending. It was something softer, more instinctive, like her heart had found a way to fill in its own blanks. One Saturday afternoon, Claire stood in the grocery aisle holding 2 brands of pasta sauce, unable to decide. Without thinking, she whispered, "Which one do you like better?" And in her mind, James answered, something about the one with basil, something about how it tasted like Sunday evenings. She smiled, put the jar in the basket, and only then realized what she had done. That night, she typed out a message on her phone. "Can't wait for you to get home. I made the pasta you love." She stared at it for a long moment, heart pounding, and then hit send, to herself. It wasn't a mistake. She wanted to read it from the other side, to pretend for 1 second that someone had thought of her first, and when the message arrived, she read it like it wasn't her fingers that had written it. She smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in weeks. From that day on, she created a separate contact in her phone. Just his name, James. Sometimes she would send voice notes describing the view from the window or reading him the first lines of a book she thought he'd like. She knew it was pretend, but it made her feel alive. What startled her most wasn't how easily she stepped into the illusion, but how much she needed it. Each interaction with James, though fabricated, peeled back a layer of quiet longing she hadn't realized was still there. One evening, just before winter pressed its first frost against the window panes, Claire wrote the line that would haunt her later. "You make me feel like I'm not too much." It wasn't part of a letter. It was scribbled on a napkin while she waited for the kettle to boil. She pinned it to her corkboard above the desk, next to real things, bill reminders, old receipts, a postcard from Maggie. Somehow it fit in. Somehow it felt earned. She didn't tell anyone about James, not because she was ashamed, but because explaining him felt like ruining something sacred. Maggie once teased her about being too selective, too romantic, too caught up in the idea of connection rather than its reality. Claire only smiled and sipped her coffee. What would Maggie say if she knew Claire had fallen for a man with no past, no voice, no flaws beyond those Claire imagined and forgave? Still, James wasn't just a daydream. He was a mirror held gently to the parts of herself she never dared show. When she cried, he stayed. When she doubted, he reassured. He never left dishes in the sink, never raised his voice, never forgot her birthday. He was the best kind of impossibility, the kind that filled a space without asking her to shrink, and yet, as she sat at her desk that night, staring at the unfinished letter from weeks ago, something inside her shifted. For the first time, she read her words not as comfort, but as a question. If he was never real, what does that make me? Someone who loved him? She picked up her pen, the letter trembling in her grasp, and added the final sentence. "I named you, and then I wrote the love story myself." She underlined it once, twice, then leaned back in her chair, heart racing not from grief, but from truth. There was a summer afternoon that Claire remembered with more clarity than any actual summer she'd lived. In her memory, the sun was mild, filtered through cotton clouds, and the breeze had the kind of calm that made leaves dance lazily along the sidewalk. She'd packed a basket, cheese, grapes, 2 croissants, and a book of poems they were reading, together. She laid out a checkered blanket in the park, sat cross-legged, and imagined James beside her, reading aloud while she pretended not to notice how tenderly he spoke her favorite lines. She remembered how, in that imagined moment, he had said, "You don't have to be strong when you're with me." And she believed him, not just because she wanted to, but because her body exhaled differently when she pictured him saying it. Shoulders lowering, throat unclenching, breath moving like it hadn't in years. In reality, she had eaten alone, on a bench. The book stayed, closed in her lap, and the croissants were slightly stale. But she smiled the entire time. The memories with James were stitched across the fabric of her life like patches. Unreal, but warm. On snowy evenings, she lit candles and curled beneath a knit blanket, reading aloud as if someone was listening. She had a favorite mug that she called his, though no one knew why. It was chipped at the rim and stained from too many teas, but she never used it herself. It sat on the second shelf, untouched, always ready for him. Once, when she came, down with the flu and could hardly get out of bed, she wrote a letter between coughs and feverish dreams. She imagined James placing a cool cloth on her forehead, tucking her in, whispering that she wasn't alone. The next morning, she found a teacup on her nightstand and couldn't remember whether she had placed it there or if it was just wishful thinking. In the letter, she thanked him anyway. There were so many letters like that, soft, daily, ordinary. She never asked James to save her. She simply let him exist as the quiet presence who never judged her silences, never asked for more than she could give, never reminded her of who she hadn't become. Maggie had always suspected Claire was hiding something, but not in the way one hides shame or secrets. It was subtler, like someone keeping a snow globe perfectly still so as not to stir the storm inside. One Thursday afternoon, as they sat by the window in Maggie's bookshop, watching the clouds roll in over the bay, Claire casually mentioned a line James had said to her the night before. "He told me I should read less about heartbreak and more about wonder," Claire said with a soft smile, sipping her tea as if the comment had come from someone flesh and blood. Maggie blinked. "James?" Claire nodded, eyes dreamy. Maggie hesitated. "Claire, you talk about him like he's real." Claire laughed, not the dismissive kind, but the gentle, forgiving kind. "Of course he's not, but he's consistent. That's more than I can say for most." "You mean he's always there? Because you make him be?" Claire tilted her head. "I don't think I made him. I think I found him. Somewhere in between the parts of myself I never gave anyone else." Maggie leaned forward, her voice quieter now. "If a real man walked into your life tomorrow, someone kind, imperfect, maybe even good for you, would you even notice him?" Claire's smile faltered, just for a second. Then she whispered, "No one's ever been close enough to mistake him for James." Maggie didn't respond. She only nodded, gently, and reached across the table to touch Claire's hand. The silence between them was neither awkward nor heavy, just full. That evening, Claire returned home and opened her desk drawer. The letters were still there, some yellowed at the edges, some freshly folded. She pulled one out at random. It was one of her favorites, the one where James took her to the lighthouse she always wanted to visit. The one where he packed thermoses of hot cocoa and asked if she believed in parallel universes, because he liked to think there was a version of them out there, dancing without fear. She read it twice. Then she slowly, delicately, tore it down. The center. The sound was crisp and shocking, like a bone breaking in a quiet room. Her breath caught. And then, slowly, almost apologetically, she taped the two halves back together. The letter now bore a scar, thin, silver tape running down its spine like an old wound someone tried to forget, but couldn't. Claire smoothed it against the desk, her fingertips pressing gently as if to coax the torn halves into remembering. They once belonged together. She didn't cry. Not then. The ache had matured into something quieter, a tightness in her chest that felt like both resignation and reverence. Later that night, she placed the mended letter back into the drawer, but on top this time, as if it deserved a place of honor. She didn't write another. Not that night. Instead, she sat on her balcony, wrapped in a shawl, the air crisp with the kind of cold that announced winter was near. Oliver curled at her feet, purring against her ankles. Claire looked out at the dark street below. Lights. flickering in windows, the town slowly tucking itself in. She thought of all the people behind those windows, some arguing, some holding hands, some scrolling through their phones with one hand while the other rested on someone's back. And she wondered how many of them were with the person they imagined. How many, like her, were quietly loving someone they had crafted in the shadows of their own need. A gust of wind stirred her hair. She closed her eyes and imagined James sitting beside her, holding her hand in his warm, calloused one. She imagined him turning to her and saying, "You're doing better than you think." She almost believed it, but something inside her shifted. So, slightly, she wasn't even sure it happened. A voice, her own this time, rose up to meet the illusion. But maybe it's time someone real says that to me. The days that followed unfolded in quiet rituals. Claire found herself revisiting old letters, not to reread them, but to rearrange them. Monday's letter went beneath Thursday's. The one from the rainy weekend took its place beside the snowstorm entry. She wasn't archiving memories. She was curating them. Like a museum of a love story only she had ever walked through. Each piece held a scene too vivid to dismiss. There was the time James had waited for her in a bookstore, tucked between the philosophy section and local authors, holding a copy of something obscure, something he claimed smelled like her mind. She had invented that entire encounter, after a dream in which a stranger in a brown coat had smiled at her and said nothing, but his eyes had lingered just long enough to stay. Then there was the trip they never took to the coast of Nova Scotia. Claire had printed out itineraries, circled charming bed and breakfasts, even gone so far as to buy a travel journal. In the letter she wrote that weekend, James had described their walk along the cliffs, how her scarf kept flying into his face, how she laughed so hard she dropped her camera into the sand. She still kept that scarf in a drawer, though it had never left Maine. And yet, with each memory she revisited, something else began to press at her. A gentle, persistent dissonance. The letters, once soothing, now felt curated. Not false, but too flawless. James never got angry, never forgot to call, never misunderstood her. He existed in perfect rhythm with her inner monologue, always agreeing, always knowing what to say. Real love, Claire thought, had never been that neat. She remembered arguments with her ex-husband, messy, sharp, and unresolvable. She remembered the ache of being seen only partially, the exhaustion of having to explain herself over and over. And though she didn't miss him, she missed the friction of reality, the raw, unscripted moments that proved something had been alive. She looked down at the tape on the mended letter and whispered aloud, "You never made me feel small, James. But you never challenged me either." It wasn't an accusation. It was a truth she hadn't dared say before. That night, Claire didn't write. Instead, she pulled out a blank page and left it empty on purpose, a silence waiting for someone, real or imagined, to fill it. Claire once wrote James a letter about a memory that never happened. It was snowing, and they were walking home from a Christmas market. In the story, he bought her roasted chestnuts even though she didn't like them, just so he could warm her hands with the paper bag. She'd made up that memory during a particularly cold December night, when the sound of laughter from the neighboring apartment made her kitchen feel even quieter. She had stood at the window with a mug of tea, fingers frozen around the ceramic, and imagined him brushing snowflakes from her hair with the kind of gentleness that people only write about. Later, she folded that letter into an envelope and tucked it inside a wool sweater she hadn't worn since. Every time she reached for it, she felt the weight of it there, soft, hidden, waiting. There was also the piano. Claire didn't play. Not well, at least. But sometimes, on Sundays, she would press one or two notes, let them hang in the room like questions without answers. In one letter, she wrote that James played piano for her when her migraines made light unbearable. He played Debussy, and she would lie on the couch, eyes closed, letting the music stroke the inside of her mind like fingers over water. She'd written it because the idea of someone knowing how to soothe her without being asked felt like the greatest luxury. She never dared want that in real life. Wanting too much had always led to disappointment. But in her letters, she could want without shame. Still, lately, even the wanting felt heavy. She began noticing cracks, not in James, but in herself. She'd try to write a new letter and pause halfway, uncertain of the voice she was using. Was she still speaking to him? Or to the version of herself who needed him to exist? One night, while looking for a misplaced receipt, Claire stumbled across the very first letter she had ever written to James. The handwriting was shakier, the tone more tentative, almost embarrassed. It had begun. Dear you, I don't know who you are yet, but I need you to be gentle. She read it aloud, slowly. Then, for the first time, she folded it shut and whispered, maybe now. I can be that person for myself. The day Claire stopped believing in James didn't come with a storm. There were no slamming doors, no spilled wine, no final line whispered under a rain-soaked sky. It came quietly, in the form of a Tuesday so painfully ordinary that it almost mocked her. She had forgotten to buy milk. The mail contained nothing but bills. And Oliver had knocked over a plant she no longer had the heart to repot. That was all. She sat in her living room, barefoot, the sleeves of her cardigan tugged over her hands like a child trying to disappear into herself. On the coffee table sat the teacup she always imagined James would hand to her when she felt like this. Porcelain with a blue rim, slightly chipped, always warm. Only this time it was cold, and empty, and untouched since morning. She stared at it for a long time, unable to look away. And then the words came, not written, not whispered, but felt. He's not real. It didn't hit her like lightning. It settled like dust, gently, inevitably, like something she'd always known but refused to say aloud. She rose slowly, walked to her desk, and opened the drawer that had become something of a shrine. Dozens of letters rested inside, chronological, careful, and heartbreakingly sincere. She ran her fingers across them, touching each page as if it held breath. For a moment, she was tempted to pull one out, to reread his words, her words, to rekindle the comfort they used to bring. But she didn't. Not this time. Instead, she sat down and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. She picked up her pen, hesitated, and finally wrote, James, you were never real, but I loved you more honestly than I've ever loved anyone. The ink looked darker than usual. The truth always did. She paused, blinked hard against a sting in her eyes, and whispered into the silence that had once been his voice. I think I made you because I didn't believe anyone real could love me like you did. The sentence stared back at her, unwavering. She had read it 3 times now, each time slower, as if dissecting its anatomy could somehow make the pain cleaner. But it didn't. The wound wasn't sharp. It was dull, deep, and oddly tender, like touching a bruise you forgot you had. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Images came in soft flickers. James tucking her hair behind her ear as she cried. James reading Neruda under the glow of the floor lamp. James holding her hand, whispering, You're not hard to love. Every memory felt like it belonged in a life that could have been real. But she knew better now. Those were her hands, her whispers, her comfort projected outward because she couldn't find anyone safe enough to give it to. And maybe that's what broke her most. Not that James wasn't real, but that she had needed someone imaginary just to feel seen. She stood, restlessly, pacing across the room. The letter remained unfinished on the desk, the pen uncapped, drying quietly. Oliver followed her with his eyes but didn't move. He knew this rhythm. He had seen her do this before, when she lost her mother, when her marriage ended, when the world got too loud. But this time, something was different. She wasn't collapsing. She was confronting. Claire walked to the mirror in the hallway and looked at herself. The truth had already settled in her bones. Now it needed somewhere to go. She spoke to the woman in the mirror. "You invented a man because you were too tired to ask for love." The reflection didn't blink. She nodded, accepting it. No drama. No denial. And then, unexpectedly, she smiled, because for all the sadness, there was something else blooming beneath the ache. A clarity. A gentleness. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't broken. She was lonely. And she had chosen survival in the most creative, self-forgiving way she knew how. She didn't need to be ashamed of James. He had given her what no one else had dared to offer, space to hope again. But now, it was time to offer that space to someone who might actually knock on her door. Later that evening, Claire brewed a cup of tea. Not for James, not for comfort, but for the simple act of warming her own hands. She sat in her chair by the window, watching as the last light of the day slipped below the horizon. The world was quiet, and for once, she didn't rush to fill the silence. She reached for one of the oldest letters. The envelope had softened from being handled so often, and inside was a scene that had once made her heart ache with longing. In it, James had taken her to a bookstore on her birthday. He'd bought her a first edition of her favorite novel and written in the margins, "You are every chapter I didn't know I was waiting to read." She read the line aloud. Then, very gently, she whispered, "That was me. I wrote that for me." The realization was like slipping into cold water and discovering you could float. James had never existed, but the love she imagined, that was hers. Every word, every gesture, every moment, born from the kind of deep, intuitive tenderness she'd always been afraid was too much for someone else to carry, and maybe it was. But that didn't mean it was wasted. She didn't tear the letter up. She didn't file it away. She placed it in a new folder labeled, "What I Once Believed." It wasn't grief she felt now. It was reverence. She allowed herself to remember the night she made James real, the book that disappointed her, the wine that loosened her heart, the silence that begged to be filled. She had been brave, in a quiet, private way. She had saved herself by inventing someone who wouldn't abandon her. But now, she was strong enough to walk beside someone imperfect, someone who didn't speak in poetry or know exactly when to say the right thing. Someone who might forget birthdays, spill coffee, fall silent at the wrong moment, but stay. Stay. Not because she had imagined it, but because he chose to. That was the difference. And now, she was ready to try. The next morning, Claire didn't reach for her pen. She reached for her coat. There was a farmer's market in town every Saturday, something she hadn't visited since last spring. Not because she didn't want to, but because she'd always told herself James would take her when the time was right. He'd hold her hand as they walked past stalls of sunflowers and handmade soaps, laughing at the price of artisanal honey. But now, she didn't need James for that. She just needed herself. The air was cool, touched by the faint scent of apples and cinnamon. People milled about in quiet delight, hands full of fresh bread and coffee cups. Claire walked slowly, not rushing, allowing the morning to meet her as she was, unguarded, present, real. Someone bumped into her by accident. She smiled, said, "Excuse me," and moved on. It wasn't a moment worth remembering, but somehow, it felt significant. It was her first interaction without James in the background of her thoughts. Later, she stopped by Maggie's bookshop, picked up a used novel, and paused at the door before leaving. Maggie, ever watchful, called after her. "You look different," Claire smiled, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "I feel lighter. Maggie nodded, not asking why. She didn't need to. Friends know when someone has walked out of a chapter, even if they wrote it themselves. That evening, Claire returned home and sat down at her desk. She opened a new notebook, one untouched by James, and turned to the first page. She didn't write a letter. She wrote a list. Things I can do alone. Visit the lighthouse. Bake the lemon cake I always imagined he'd love. Wear the gray cardigan without pretending it belonged to anyone else. Read Neruda out loud, for no one but me. She stopped after that, feeling something warm rise in her chest. For the first time, the silence in the room didn't feel like absence. It felt like possibility. And with that, Claire whispered one final thank you, not to James, but to herself, for surviving. For imagining. And now, for choosing to live in the real world, messy, flawed, but hers. That night, as the wind rattled softly against her window and the streetlights cast trembling gold on her kitchen tiles, Claire stayed up later than usual. Not out of sadness or the fear of sleep, but because she wasn't quite done listening to herself. There was something tender unfolding inside her, like a bruise healing from the inside out. She didn't want to rush it. She walked through her apartment slowly, as if rediscovering each object in its rightful place. The plant Oliver had knocked over was still tilted, the dirt half spilled, the roots exposed. She could have fixed it, days ago, but hadn't. Now she knelt down, fingers gently pressing the soil back into the pot, whispering to the leaves, "You've waited long enough." She wasn't just talking to the plant. In the hallway, she passed the mirror again. The same one she had stood before, accusing herself, forgiving herself. But this time, she didn't stop. She didn't need her own reflection to believe the change had begun. She carried it in her step now. Before bed, she reached into the drawer where James once lived. She didn't touch the letters. Instead, she added a new one. Blank. Untitled. Sealed in an envelope with no words inside. It wasn't a letter to James. It was a placeholder, a symbol of the possibility that someone else, someone real, might someday write back. And even if no one did, she'd still have this. The knowledge that she could love. Fully. Imaginatively. Unapologetically. And now, truthfully. She placed the envelope on top of the others and closed the drawer softly, like closing the final page of a book that had carried her through a long, dark winter. The story didn't end with fireworks. It ended with a whisper and the warmth of someone learning to be okay with her own company. Claire turned off the lights, climbed into bed, and let the silence come. But this time, it wasn't James who filled it. It was her own breath, steady and unafraid. It was enough. It was in the grocery store 2 weeks later that the grief returned, not for James, but for something far more unsettling. Claire was reaching for a jar of apricot preserves, her hand hesitating between two brands she'd never cared about, when she caught sight of a man down the aisle. He had salt and pepper hair, wore a navy jacket, and looked up just as she did. Their eyes met for less than 2 seconds. He smiled, warm and passing, and then turned back to his cart, moving on. Like people do, it wasn't attraction. It wasn't recognition. It was familiarity. And in that brief, silent moment, something inside Claire shattered. Not because the man reminded her of James, but because he didn't. He reminded her of someone she once knew. A real man. A quiet friend from years ago who had asked her once over tea and nervous laughter if she wanted to go to the coast with him. She had said no. Not because she didn't like him, but because she had just started writing to James. She had told herself she wasn't ready, that the timing was off, that he wouldn't understand her inner world the way James did. But what she really meant was, he didn't match the man in her letters. Claire stood frozen in the aisle, the jar still in her hand. the hum of the freezer blending into the rush of blood in her ears. Her knees didn't buckle. Her chest didn't cave. But something inside her slumped, quiet and irreversible. She whispered, not to anyone. I chose a dream over a hand that was reaching for me. And that was the true loss. James hadn't stolen her future. She had turned away from it herself, for safety, for perfection, for the illusion of a love that would never ask her to compromise, apologize, or forgive. But love in the real world was made of all those things. And now, she wasn't sure if the man from all those years ago still lived nearby, or if he was married, or if he ever thought of her when it rained. She only knew that she hadn't thought of him in years, until that second, in that aisle, when she realized he had been real, and she had walked away. That night, Claire didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, knees tucked under her, chin, the gray cardigan draped loosely over her shoulders like a ghost she no longer feared. The apartment was still, the kind of still that didn't comfort, only magnified. Oliver curled against her leg, purring softly, as if sensing her heart moving through something she couldn't yet name. She opened her journal and didn't write to James. She didn't write at all. She just stared at the blank page and whispered, into the dark, I missed something real because I was too busy holding on to something safe. The truth wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was kind. It forgave her, but it didn't give back what she had lost. She remembered the day she met the guy, man she now couldn't name, the way he had offered to walk her home, the way he had smiled when she spoke about the ocean and asked, "Do you ever go just to watch the waves, even when it's cold?" She had loved that question. She had written it into one of her letters, to James, as if James had been the one to ask it. She had stolen real moments and fed them to a fiction. That was the wound. It wasn't the love for James that broke her. It was realizing she had redirected the parts of herself that were still soft and willing, to someone who could never truly return them. James had been a shield, a sanctuary. But in loving him, she had not protected herself. She had kept herself untouched. And in doing so, she had missed the chance to be truly seen by someone who stood right there, holding a cup of coffee and asking if she wanted to try again next weekend. She hadn't even said goodbye. Not to him, not to the chance he represented. She had just drifted, smiling politely, saying, maybe another time. And there hadn't been another time. Now, she closed the journal and stared into the quiet of her room. There were no letters left to write, no imagined voices left to fill the gaps. Just a woman learning, slowly and far too late, that even dreams have consequences. She wondered then how many versions of herself she had denied over the years, how many open doors she'd passed without peeking in, too preoccupied with the safety of a fantasy to risk the unpredictability of something real. Real people disappointed. Real people left. But they also showed up late, forgot your birthday, laughed too loudly, and made you feel less alone just by existing beside you. And maybe, just maybe, there had been a time when she was brave enough to try for that. Maybe the girl who once said no to coffee by the coast hadn't meant no. She'd meant, please ask me again next week when I'm not so scared. But he never did. And James, always polite, always patient, never had to deal with rejection. He didn't leave, because he'd never arrived. Now, Claire walked through her flat slowly, turning off lights. She paused at the desk one last time, letting her fingers graze the edge. She didn't write. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, in the dim glow of the hallway, and whispered, I'm sorry. Not to you, James, to the man I never let in. And then, finally, she went to bed, alone, but wide awake, with the sharp, tender ache of having finally told herself the truth. 3 days after the journal closed, Claire received a letter. It wasn't, In a romantic envelope or a cryptic package, it arrived with the rest of her mail, tucked between a utility bill and a flyer for discounted roof repairs. The return address was familiar, but she couldn't place it at first. Only after she opened the envelope did her breath catch. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, lined with faint blue, and a handwriting she hadn't seen in over a decade. Clean, square, a little too careful, like someone who still double-checked their spelling. It began simply, "I don't know if this will reach you, but I kept your address." Her fingers trembled. The name signed at the bottom, Elliot, was a whisper from a different lifetime. The man she'd once said no to, the one who had asked her about waves and winter air, the one she had convinced herself would never understand, the world inside her. The one she had written about, unknowingly, in her first letter to James. She sat down slowly, reading. "I saw you weeks ago at the market. You were picking out apples. I thought to say something, but you looked happy. Not performatively happy. Quietly so. I didn't want to interrupt that." Claire blinked hard, but then I remembered something. "Years ago, you once gave me a postcard with a Neruda quote on the back. I never told you I kept it. I carried it in my coat pocket for so long the ink wore off. I only remembered your handwriting when I saw you again." The letter wasn't long. It didn't ask for anything. It didn't reopen old wounds. It simply ended with, "I hope you're still reading poetry, and that someone listens when you recite it out loud." There was no return phone number, just an address, the same town, a few blocks away. Claire pressed the letter to her chest and exhaled, not in grief, but in something quieter, recognition. She read the letter again, slower this time, tracing, each word like it might dissolve if she blinked too long. There was no dramatic declaration, no unmet confession, just warmth, memory, the kind of presence that didn't need to shout to be heard. Claire walked over to her bookshelf and found the drawer where she kept old postcards, forgotten between coupons and torn scraps of poetry. And there it was. The Neruda quote she had written on the back of a beach photograph, given to Elliot after a conversation about salt and solitude. "I love you as certain dark things are to be loved, in secret, between the shadow and the soul." She had forgotten she gave it to him. Or maybe, more truthfully, she hadn't believed it mattered enough to be remembered. She sat in the chair by the window, letter in hand, heart pulled in directions both new and achingly familiar. It wasn't that Elliot had waited. It was that he'd noticed, quietly, without condition, without demand. And in all the time she had poured herself into a man who never existed, there had been someone, real, gentle, imperfect, who had carried a small piece of her in his pocket. Long after she had walked away, she didn't cry, not for James, not for Elliot, but for the girl she had been, the one who hadn't believed she could be loved in silence. Now she knew better. She pulled a fresh card from her drawer, one with a watercolor sky and no printed words, and began to write. "I read Neruda out loud last week. The cat fell asleep, halfway through. I think you would have stayed until the end. No promises, no explanations, just the beginning of a reply." And as she sealed the envelope, Claire smiled. Not because everything had changed, but because something had shifted. Someone had remembered her softness, even when she forgot it herself. The next morning, Claire didn't rush to send the letter. It sat on the table beside her breakfast, half shadowed by a cooling cup of tea. She watched the envelope like it might decide for itself whether to go or stay, whether the story it could, spark was worth the risk of silence. She'd spent so long speaking into a void of her own making that the idea of someone answering felt strangely fragile. What if Elliot had only written out of nostalgia? What if his words weren't an invitation but a closing paragraph, neatly folded into memory? But then she remembered the way her name had looked in his handwriting. Not dramatic, not overly stylized, just careful, considered, like someone who hadn't spoken for years, but still knew how to speak softly. And maybe that was enough. She dressed slowly, thoughtfully. No makeup, no perfume. Just her. The version of herself who didn't need to impress, didn't need to disappear into poetry to be worthy of attention. She tucked the envelope into her coat pocket and walked to the post box 2 blocks away, every step deliberate. When she slid the letter in, she didn't make a wish. She made peace. Not with the past, not even with James, but with the part of herself that had waited so long to be real to someone. Claire turned and walked home, the wind light at her back. She didn't look back at the red box, and yet, something about the air felt different, as if someone, somewhere, had just exhaled at the same moment she did. Days passed, and nothing came. No knock on the door. No reply in the mailbox. No sign that the letter had even arrived where it was meant to. But Claire didn't unravel. Instead, she returned to her life, one small choice at a time. She bought tulips instead of lilies at the Saturday market, just because they looked a little chaotic in their vase. She rearranged the bookshelves, placing her favorite novels at eye level, as if reminding herself she deserved beauty within reach. She took walks to the coast more often, no longer waiting for someone to offer a hand or ask the right question. She started speaking aloud again. To no one. To herself. To the wind. One afternoon, while cleaning out a cabinet she hadn't opened, in years she found the old phone she used during the time she first created James. She turned it on, not expecting it to work, but the screen flickered to life with surprising warmth. And there, tucked beneath a dozen voicemails and missed alerts, was a folder labeled James. She opened it slowly. Inside were voice memos. Some recorded, some blank. One, dated almost a year ago, made her pause. She pressed play. Her own voice filled the room, young, unsure, trembling. James, I had a good day. I don't know who else to tell that to. Claire smiled, not out of embarrassment, but out of grace. Because now she knew exactly who to tell. She deleted the folder, placed the phone back in the drawer, and lit a candle. Not as a ritual, but as warmth. The kind of warmth that asks for nothing but presence. One evening, as winter began to curl its fingers around the edges of town, Claire sat by her window with a cup of tea. Not the usual one. This one had orange peel and cinnamon, a flavor she used to find too much, but now appreciated for its persistence. The candle beside her had burned low, its wax forming quiet rivers down the glass. She watched as people walked by, some in pairs, some alone, some pausing briefly at the crosswalk before continuing on. No one looked up. No one needed to. The world moved at its own pace, and she, finally, was no longer chasing it. Her mailbox remained silent. No letter from Elliot. And strangely, that was okay, because the point hadn't been the reply. It had been the sending. It had been the courage to lift her eyes from the story she'd written in her head and look, really look, at the life unfolding outside it. That night, she opened a new notebook, not to write a letter or record a dream, but to begin something else entirely. A chapter with no names yet, just her thoughts, undressed and honest. Page 1 began. Today I made soup and didn't imagine sharing it, and it still tasted like enough. She paused, pen in hand, and let the quiet fill the room. Not as absence, not as punishment, but as company. The next morning, a breeze pushed through the cracks of her old windows. The sky was pale. Claire stepped outside without a jacket, just for a moment, to feel the cold on her arms. It reminded her she was still here, still feeling, still open. Somewhere, out there, There might be someone holding on to the same quiet hope. But whether or not he ever arrived wasn't the ending she needed, because she had already come home to herself. If you've ever loved someone quietly, in your mind, in your heart, in the spaces no one else could see, tell me. Maybe we're not the only ones still waiting for someone, in a world that keeps moving too fast.